On the next slide, you can see first is that low representation. What's underneath that? The second is corporate D&I has been working at this for 20 odd years, right? And yet we're seeing limited progress, especially when it comes to Black representation. One other concerning trend we saw was a lot of companies look, and there's been a lot talked about this in the past few months, look at their numbers for Latinx, Black, and Asian experiences together under one umbrella rather than understand the differentiated experience based on race, and certainly not intersectionally based on gender. And then finally, what we saw when we were conducting the research, and this has thankfully changed in our culture over the past few months, is companies were uncomfortable even saying that systemic racism was at play in the workplace. Right? That's something that we've now become comfortable saying in a short period of time, but we didn't see companies owning that systemic racism is embedded in our workplaces, and we wanted to call that out. So in order to do that, on the next slide, you can see our methods. We conducted an in-depth literature review. These are the methods we apply to every study we do. Held focus groups and interviews with dozens of professionals and Black leaders, and then did a nationally representative survey in partnership with an organization out of the University of Chicago to understand the experience of college-educated professionals, Black and not Black, so that we could tell the differentiated story for Black professionals of many different backgrounds. So let's talk about what we found in this study and in another study that's really relevant to this audience that we did a few years ago called Black Women Ready to Lead, that was all about the experience of Black women specifically. So first, a couple of points from that Black Women Ready to Lead study, if we can go 2 slides ahead. The first thing we found is, of course, Black women are very ambitious, and they're actually report higher levels of ambition than white female colleagues. So 22% of Black women say, I aspire to a powerful position with a prestigious title, right? Like this group gathered today, very in touch with their aspirations to rise to the top of their companies. To have the confidence that they can succeed, right? And to be working on that and having to shore that up is sometimes in circumstances that are not supportive. So 43% of Black women versus 30% of white women. We often hear about the confidence code and challenges for confidence for white women. That is not the challenge that Black women are facing at the same levels. And also to have more clarity around long-term goals. So we can see the gap there too. 40% of Black women have clear long-term goals versus less than a third of white women. And yet, despite having this strong ambition, confidence, and goal orientation, on the next slide we see, unfortunately, Black women feel stalled, right? They're far more likely to feel they're not advancing in their careers and their talents are not recognized by their superiors. You know, another fact that we gathered in this study, so we can see the differentiated experience here. That differentiated experience often isn't acknowledged by white women. And in fact, what we documented in the study, being Black in corporate America, you can see on the next slide, is that Black professionals, both men and women, are more likely to see white women as the primary beneficiaries of diversity and inclusion efforts at their companies. I can't tell you the number of conversations that I've had with companies when they told me, you know, we've got to solve for gender first, right? And when they say gender, they often mean white women. So maybe without even realizing it, but that's the implication. And so this is a phenomenon that's going on that many white women are not aware of or acknowledging. I've had lots of conversations with Trudy, who was an advisor on this study about it, and I'm sure we'll circle back to that later in the day, so stick around for that. So we see that professionals believe white women are the primary beneficiaries if they're Black. And then on the next slide, we can see something that everyone acknowledges, which is that white women are not using our power to advocate for other underrepresented groups at our companies. Now, you know, I'm an optimist. I hope these numbers have moved a little bit, given our recent reckoning on race in this country and our continued reckoning on race. But this is a true call to action, especially for white women, to be aware, more aware of our own power, our own gains, and to be better allies for Black women, and for both Black and white women to understand how to build that allyship from the core of established organizations within our companies like employee resource groups and other methods to be able to push for the advancement of Black women alongside white women. Because the reality is that Black women are getting less from the workplace around them. We see they're getting less from their networks on the next page, and networks are going to be a drumbeat for me throughout these remarks. You know, we can see that white women are more likely to have people in their networks who help them navigate tough situations, give them honest feedback, provide emotional support. A lot of times we're straddling the majority-minority line here, right, in terms of who's getting this. So only 39% of Black women get this honest feedback versus 57% of white women. And so that's the kind of advice and mentorship that white women are more likely to get. They're also more likely to get advocacy, meaningful advocacy and sponsorship, right? They're more likely to be recommended for a career development opportunity, have their ideas backed in meetings, receive that advocacy for their ideas or skills. And so this is all happening, this is all going on, and yet this is something that many white professionals are not aware of. On the next slide, you know, the highest bar here is among Black women. 69% of Black women say, yeah, Black employees have to work harder to advance in their careers. That is true. Only 16% of white women agree with that statement. So there is this gap in terms of, and difference in terms of the terrain that you are navigating as Black women in the workplace. And it's something that many of your white colleagues are not seeing or aware of. And this is kind of the biggest finding out of our study, being Black in corporate America, that we wanted to see as this call to action for broad systemic awareness and change, especially among employees who are white, who may be in positions of power, to drive change. What is the differentiated experience, right? We already covered a couple of things around networks, around D&I more focused on white women than on race, which I'm hopeful is changing at a lot of companies. And I know a lot of companies are reorienting their priorities right now. But there are other things at play. So let's talk about those. The next thing I want to talk about is racial prejudice at work. So in 2 slides ahead, you can see that Black professionals are indeed more likely than any other group to encounter racial prejudice in the workplace. This is evenly experienced by Black men and Black women. It's a majority of Black professionals who experience this versus less than 50% of white, Latinx, or Asian professionals. Sometimes this prejudice does still unfortunately show up in the form of direct harassment or bullying. Sometimes and often it shows up in more subtle ways, ways that are called microaggressions. And I know that that is a term that is controversial, right? Because sometimes microaggressions can actually be quite aggressive and can certainly have a very deep impact. And yet this is the term that's used in the literature and that we used as our framework in the study. So on the next slide, you can see how we organize the microaggressions that we documented in the study into 3 categories. This was set by a Columbia psychologist who studied racial microaggressions for many years, Daryl Dwing Sue. There's microassaults, which are kind of the closest to that ongoing harassment, overt racial slurs. There's microinvalidations, statements or behaviors that undermine that someone's having an experience rooted in race. And micro-insults, those slights and snubs that remind someone that they are an outsider, that they are excluded. And so what did we pick up on in terms of the racial microaggressions that Black professionals experience. 14 that Black professionals are more likely than professionals of any other background, and they're on the next slide. So one of them rises to the level of a microassault. Colleagues have used racially insensitive language around me. The others fell into the categories of micro-invalidations. Colleagues have asserted that they're colorblind. Colleagues have asserted they're not racist, or micro-insults. And a crucial one there is I've been excluded or passed over for growth opportunities. I've repeatedly been told that I'm articulate, right? The exception. I'm not like others of my race or ethnicity. And the one that, of course, Black women are more likely to experience than Black men, colleagues have touched my hair without my permission. And so I saw a question come up in the chat. Thank you all for keeping this chat going. One that came up was, do the stats alter with companies that have affiliation network groups? Curious if there's data that highlights companies that are working well in advancing Black professionals. We are going to get to that in a few slides, what sets apart companies that do support the advancement and engagement of Black professionals. I can say I don't think there's one silver bullet, right? There's a combination of factors that can be supportive. And one thing that we saw in our research specifically on women in STEM, we took an intersectional look there. And what we saw was, at least in STEM fields, Black women actually weren't getting the support from employee resource groups that white women were getting. And so that's something to think about if you're active in an employee resource group, or if your company has one. How can you shape it to make sure that it's supporting women of all backgrounds equally, right? That's a crucial piece of work for us to do. All right, so let's move to the next slide and look at the fact that as you rise in your career, unfortunately what we documented is that microaggressions actually sometimes increase at the executive level. And we did a round of interviews to understand why this is the case. And what we heard was actually that when you are more likely to be the only, others might let down their guard around you, right? Or might feel threatened. So there are a couple of things that may be going on. I see that some microaggressions are coming up. Jasmine made the comment, racial slurs will never be considered micro. It is hate speech. Completely agree. That is illegal discrimination. And if that comes up in the workplace, that is something absolutely to address. And then someone else shared an example of a microaggression, right? Being mischaracterized as angry while others are referred to as passionate. Certainly something that came up again and again in the research. I love this chat. Please do keep it going. So on the next slide, we see, we also looked into the theme of authenticity and the enormous amount of energy that authenticity takes. I'm gonna pick up the pace here a little bit because we're short on time. We picked up that for Black millennials, if we go to the next slide, this authenticity challenge is even steeper. That they're more likely than other Black professionals to say it takes a great deal of energy for me to be authentic at work. When we showed this research to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, her reaction to this slide was, you see this deeper trauma for Black millennials as they enter the workplace with more education about systemic racism, more understanding and awareness of what's going on at the world, and then the shock of the fact that they are treated differently, that they do encounter this unwelcoming environment in the work is deeper. And this is a challenge because, of course, millennials are already moving into leadership and represent the near future leadership of companies. So if you check out the full study, and I saw that someone shared a link to it, on the next slide, you can see some of the other differences that we explored. So what are the differentiated experiences if you're, say, Afro-Caribbean or of a different generation, if you attended an HBCU, sexual orientation, we looked at data from our LGBTQ respondents. So of course, there are so many layers to identity and Black identity, and we wanted to unpack many of those in our research in ways that we hadn't seen elsewhere. So how do we solve this, and what is your role, right? Because there is systemic change that needs to happen, and the onus can't be on Black professionals to close that gap that I highlighted earlier, with white professionals merely not aware, not just merely, but sometimes, having blinders on about the Black professional experience in the workplace. Well, we wanted to pick up on what does work, to someone's question earlier, in some workplaces in order to start to answer this question. So the first thing that we looked at, 2 slides ahead, is small versus large companies, because we documented, and the numbers are in the full study, this drive toward entrepreneurship, this drive towards smaller companies that are more welcoming environments, understandably, if you're navigating with an unwelcome larger company. And so we wanted to understand, what are Black professionals trading off, right? What are they giving up? What are the benefits of working at a large company versus a small company? So as you all shape your own careers, you can make informed decisions. And what we saw was those Black professionals who had worked at both places, at a large company, they were far more likely to get that financial stability, good benefits, stable income, high income, amenities like dry cleaning, for example. That's more likely to come at a large company. At a small company, they were getting that validation, right? Those intangibles that are so crucial to feeling rewarded and like you can move up in your career. A sense of belonging, acceptance from those around them, the ability to implement their ideas, trust and respect with colleagues, and of course, direct access to clients that was not on offer at large companies. So something to consider. On the next slide, when we did want to understand, to the earlier question, what, and I would focus for this audience on the box on the right, for those Black women who are staying and advancing at their companies, what are they far more likely to have? And the 5 things that rose to the top are listed here. So they're more likely to work at companies that have clear expectations around inclusive behavior. And as you vet employers, these are things to look for. A positive reputation around diversity and inclusion, clear communications of how promotions work, a CEO and president who's committed to diversity and inclusion, and accountability for harassment, to the earlier point about racial slurs, regardless of an employee's seniority or performance, right? So the things that make a difference for Black women are systemic in nature. And we think this, as an individual, gives you a guide for what are the signals to watch for in your environment, in your team, in a potential future environment or team. So that's something to keep in mind. And then the last thing I wanted to leave you with, and I'm so sorry I'm running a little bit long, I just need a couple more minutes to get through the rest of my remarks. The last thing I wanted to leave you with was this idea around advancement. So I already talked about how white women are more likely to have the advocacy from senior leaders than Black women are. We see on the next slide, Black women are also less likely than white women. So 30 versus 40%, which is a pretty significant gap. Less likely than white women to have access to senior leaders at work. Of course, white men, 49% of them have access to senior leaders at work. So there is this increased access, right, as you get closer to the center of power. But I think that the fact that Black women have less access to senior leaders demonstrates a huge contributing factor to slower advancement in their careers. And this is something that we can seek out, right? So we also see that Black professionals are less likely to have those senior leader advocates or sponsors who are advocating for their next promotion. On the next slide, again, 13% of white employees and 9% of Black employees who have this sponsor. And when you have such small figures, which is okay, right? Not everyone deserves a sponsor. It's fine that only 13% of white professionals have a sponsor. Those are top performers who are great at building relationships with senior leaders. it is a problem that they're 50% more likely than Black professionals to have that sponsor. And so we're working at CTI with companies all the time to set up sponsorship programs that educate senior leaders on the benefits and importance of sponsoring across lines of difference. But there are also things that we can do as individuals to earn sponsors, to nurture relationships with senior leaders, and to build those. And so I want to put forward that other idea to you all as you think about, what am I going to do next, right? One thing you can do is think about small versus large company. Another thing you can do is look for an employer that provides some of those things that I showed you earlier. And then a third thing you can do is on the next slide, is think about how to build and deepen a relationship with a sponsor in your career. As you build your own leadership and you're all at the point in your career where you probably benefited from acts of advocacy to get to where you are today, there's a lot you can do to better understand what sponsorship is and how it works, because that's not something that is readily taught or understood. Differentiate between a relationship with a mentor who gives you some nurturing advice versus a sponsor who actually is recommending you for opportunities. Anticipate some of the sponsorship challenges, and we have tons of research and resources on that at our website, talentinnovation.org. And approach a senior leader, right? It may be a current mentor, it may be someone else who you admire, a role model, who you can approach and start to have conversations about where you want to go in your career, what your goals are, and how they can support you. So I just summarized what's next, right? But I want to leave you with that thought. You know, whether you're thinking about the type of employer you work for, the size of employer you work for, or who you're going to work with as your next sponsor, I want you to think about the question that I have on this next slide, which is, what is next for you? Maybe it's if you're a member of an ERG, it's agitating for change in how they include women. That I don't want to give the impression that all of these systemic barriers that I've laid out, it is incumbent upon you to change. That's unfair and not realistic. And obviously, you know, the oppression that exists in our society, it's not up to Black professionals to adjust. It's up to white professionals and leaders and those in positions of power to make those adjustments. But there are things that you can do in your own career as you navigate to think about the terrain and where you want to go. So thank you so much. Appreciate the extra time. Chardonnay, I see you. I'm all good. I don't know if there's time for any questions or if you need to move to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Julia. We appreciated you sharing, and we do have time for just a few questions.
Great.
So I know that there were a couple questions that came in the chat. Really quickly, I do want to shout out Crystal Ashby, the ELC CEO, and all the other ELC members that are on and enjoying the event today. So I did see a question from Makisha AJ. And it says, did you not see funding for external conferences as important for Black women as well as men? And I think that was in conjunction with some of the solutions you were sharing with us.
That's right, Makisha. Thank you for asking that question. And I know I was whipping so fast through those slides and going so fast that I didn't really pause to explain what's underneath all of them. So we actually showed Black men and Black women the exact same list of things their companies may offer for them. And then we looked at those Black men who were advancing and staying at their companies, and we looked at those Black women who were advancing and staying at their companies and compared what were they most likely to have. We actually, the data showed completely different lists for Black men and for Black women. So while, of course, external conferences like the one you're at today are great resources and great ways to meet other Black women and important in building your career and may make a huge difference to you as an individual. What we saw from the data is that they're particularly important for Black men. They reach that top 5 list, whereas those that reached the top 5 list for Black women were far more about the system they were operating within and having those expectations for leaders, those clear ways to move up. And clear ways to address harassment and issues like
Thanks so much for that, Julia. There was another question from Amia Douglas. She asked, how are these numbers impacted for those over 50? So
such a good question. So how does age change? We looked a little bit at that and didn't see a lot of differences, which is why we didn't end up featuring it as a separate cut. We did see a lot of differences by level. So I showed you a little bit about how executives experience more microaggressions over the course of their careers. Obviously, there's an accumulating factor. The more time that you're in the workplace, the more opportunity there is to experience a microaggression. We also looked at generation, right? So we saw that there is a difference if you're a boomer versus a Gen Xer, but within those generations, we didn't see much of a difference based on age, right? So if you're interested in that age question and the baby boomer question, which is closer to those over 50, I would look at the research and pay attention to those storylines. One that stood out was, almost, and this played out in some of the focus groups that we had too, some differences in philosophy around approach to navigating work, right? So from millennials, we heard this really strong desire to be authentic, to have their environments change to support them. And from older Black professionals, what we heard was, I had to assimilate to fit in. That's how I moved ahead. And there was a bit of a generation gap there. That was one thing that we picked up on. Any other questions?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much. We had a really great question come in from Jasmine Richardson, and she's asking, what are successful strategies to activate white women into being active allies and not defensive or threatened by helping advocate for advancement opportunities for other Black women?
That is such a great question, Jasmine. Trudy and I are going to spend some time this afternoon talking about this specific topic. So I'm hopeful that everyone can stick around. To give you a little bit of a preview there, I think this is very tricky. And I think there's a lot of responsibility on white women to get better at having these conversations and not get defensive, right? And as controversial as sometimes the book White Fragility is, I think it does give a lot of white women those tools they need to engage in conversation. I think that it helps to have a shared goal in the conversation. So to be trying to accomplish something together, and maybe an employee resource group can be a place for that, or a work goal can be a place for that. I also think there are ways that you can try out having a conversation with people, and then if there are signals that someone's got there, that someone isn't responding well, maybe that's not a conversation worth pursuing. But I think a lot of the work is on white women to get better at having these conversations and not have those defenses immediately come up.
Thank you so much for all of the great questions. Thank you guys for engaging. Thank you, Julia, for everything that you shared. We are going to keep this program rolling, and I hope that you all are getting all those nuggets of wisdom that I am. That data was really, really telling. And so if you didn't notice, the link for the full study is in the chat for those of you who want to take a deeper dive.